Hey, friends. So, a lot of you know that I'm from Oklahoma. I was, when I was in the United Methodist Church, a part of the Oklahoma Annual Conference. And Oklahoma finds itself this weekend in a very unenviable position. It looks like there's going to be a good conflict on Saturday. The reason I say that is because the conference is proactively setting the stage for a conflict. I believe it wants conflict, and I wanted to do my part to kind of avoid that. So this video is going to be spent going through some of the conference arguments as to why it is that First Church Oklahoma City should not be allowed to disaffiliate from the conference. If you haven't heard anything about this before now, that's okay. Maybe I'm going to give you some resources for doing your own research if you want. This, of course, primarily affects people in Oklahoma, but it also impacts the larger United Methodist Church and Methodist setting. There are still probably several hundred churches that are going to be seeking disaffiliation in their respective annual conferences over the rest of this year. And what happens this Saturday very much impacts whether or not that is a bad thing or a hard thing for churches, or if we can have some kind of amicable situation going forward. The dynamic I've discussed up till now is as churches disaffiliate from annual conferences, the only churches and voters left at annual conference are those who are generally not sympathetic to disaffiliation. That's why they're still there. They don't think anything's wrong. So there are probably a lot of churches coming down the pipeline that their votes to disaffiliate are not going to be ratified by the annual conference that they appeal to, and that's going to cause a lot of friction, probably lawsuits. So Jonesboro in Arkansas filed suit against the conference, and I did that interview with John Miles, their pastor, as to what's happened there. First Church in Oklahoma City filed against the conference here, alleging that the conference had acted in bad faith, which was substantiated and agreed to by Judge Althea Timmons. And so my intention in this, my hope is I'm a known quantity. People know that I lean right. However, I have this thing called integrity that's on the line that I'm hoping that the way that I explore this issue, I know there are a lot of people with the institution that are just, they're not going to hear anything. They're not open. There's nothing to say to them. I don't know how many people there are in Oklahoma that can hear something new, who actually want to know the truth, who actually have the energy for going through the facts and are open to understanding new. You know, I've tried to talk to a lot of people on the other side of this thing, and what it comes down to a lot of the time is, hey, man, I picked my side. I'm not going to leave. You know, there's nothing you can tell me that is going to change my mind. And I don't have anything kind to say about that. I think that's a very impoverished way to go through the world, whether you're talking about your religion or your politics, or if you are closed for business, then I just don't know how to validate that. So I'm not talking to you. People like that are not going to enjoy this channel, and I have no problem just saying flat out, I don't want your views, go away. But if you are a person who is capable of critical thinking, of questioning your presuppositions, and wants to make conscientious, educated decisions, which, by the way, any democratic social order depends on an informed populace. If you don't know the ins and outs of what you're talking about, you shouldn't vote. I know everybody says, oh, you got to vote and stick with your party. That's like the most un-American, undemocratic thing, you know? So it's one thing if you want to live under an aristocracy or an autocracy, fine. But if you want to be part of a democracy, if you want to have a vote, then it is morally incumbent upon you to know what you're talking about. So there's no way that we can cover all the particulars of this case in Oklahoma. I'm going to say at the front, middle, and you got to do your own research on this stuff. And to that end, I want to direct you. I've got a document, or it's a website pulled up. This is from an FAQ today. firstchurchokc.com/legal-faq-court-document. And I'll try and remember to paste that in the show notes. But it has an FAQ, and then it has all of their court documents. I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen, I mean, this had to enter the court of public opinion, so they're just being transparent. And they have, look at all these documents that they have made available to the public. These are all the exhibits from the court case. And I was there in court for one of the 2 days where the judge reviewed all of the information. And I'm close to this. I know I did an interview with Hardy Patton over at First Church. I know many of the people involved in this case. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. However, I know a lot more than most. And so what I thought we would do is the conference also put out an FAQ. So, yeah, frequently asked questions regarding the litigation brought by First UMC Oklahoma City against the conference. This is a document they sent out like a week ago to people voting. And so I thought I would go through what the conference says and then what First Church says to answer it. So I'm not going to be looking only at the materials that are sympathetic to my side, the side that makes sense to me. I'm going to look at both sides, what they have to say, and then add my own commentary, obviously, because I can't control myself in it. I got to try to make this a little bit interesting. Well, it is super interesting, so maybe I won't add much commentary. But I originally wanted to read through the judge's decision. That would take about an hour, and that's super interesting. But I just thought, what can I do that helps people navigate these issues and what's most important? So I haven't even read the FAQ answer document from First Church. Maybe they did a bad job, but let's go ahead and dive in. It's going to be messy, but just enjoy using your brain for a bit. How about that? And especially if you're from Oklahoma, really pray that you make a good decision. Well, okay, so before we do that, I wanted to trace out some important stuff. I had a lawyer call me and talk to me. He explained a couple things. One, what I anticipate the conference is doing is saying this is illegal. So there's something called the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine. So I'm going to put this on screen as I read through the definition. The ecclesiastical abstention doctrine, sometimes known as the church autonomy doctrine, is a basic bedrock principle in American constitutional law, grounded in the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. It addresses the boundary between civil and religious authority. Whatever else, quote, separation of church and state, end quote, may or may not mean, all agree that religious entities are prohibited from wielding civil power, and civil entities, legislative or judicial, are prohibited from wielding religious power. Accordingly, both religious and civil authorities are to abstain from interfering with the other's proper sphere and jurisdiction. Distilled to its essence, the doctrine commands that if a case would require a civil court to decide a matter of religious doctrine, the court should either refuse to exercise jurisdiction to adjudicate or defer to the relevant religious hierarchy. So that is what's at play here. The conference is going to argue this is ecclesiastical exercise of authority. This is our business. This is not church. This is not state business. They were wrong to step in. The reason the state did step in is because they disagree with this. It's not a matter of doctrine. It's a matter of property. It's a property dispute, and whether or not Oklahoma Annual Conference was faithful or fraudulent. Because the thing is, the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine, you can't step in if they're negligent. The state can't step in if they're negligent. Can't step in if they're incompetent. Can't step in if they're capricious. But it can and is morally incumbent to step in if they are fraudulent, if they practice fraud. So the reason that Judge Timmons made a ruling on this is because after all the information was presented over these 2 days in court with all their exhibits, all of their witnesses, it became pretty clear that the Oklahoma Annual Conference had engaged in fraud. If that had not been the case, Judge Timmons would not have been able to make a ruling. Now, of course, this is going to an appellate court where the appeals court could look at the same information and come to a different conclusion. That does happen sometimes. However, at least to one seasoned state judge that is not an activist, it looks pretty bad for the conference. So I would well, before I make the moral case, what substantiates fraud? Why is it that if you've read, well, okay, here's what I got from a lawyer. Fraud is a narrow exception to the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine's normal bar against civil court jurisdiction. It is defined by Black's Law Dictionary, a standard legal reference book, as an intentional perversion of truth for the purpose of inducing another, in reliance upon it, to part with some valuable thing belonging to him or her, to surrender a legal right. A false representation of a matter of fact, whether by words or by conduct, by false or misleading allegations, or by concealment of that which should have been disclosed, which deceives and is intended to deceive another, so that he shall act upon it to his legal injury. And so fraud is a generic term, this goes on, generally synonymous with bad faith. As distinguished from negligence, it is always positive and intentional. Elements of a cause of action for fraud include a false representation of a present or past fact made by the defendant, or act of concealment by the defendant, action and reliance thereupon by plaintiff, and damage resulting to plaintiff from such misrepresentation. Okay, so hopefully I'm interviewing that lawyer here soon. But when you're looking at what's at play here, it's a building. So what First Church argued and what was sustained and acknowledged in court was this is not a doctrinal issue. This is a real estate issue where the annual conference acted in bad faith, speaking and acting dishonestly in order to gain a property that is morally under the claim of a local congregation. So the two main responses that I've personally seen, and I know I said we're going to get into this document, but it's my show. I'm going to do what I want. The two main arguments I've seen are the state has no right, and so I've addressed that in the ecclesiastical abstention doctrine. So the state does have a right, and in fact, I would say it's morally incumbent upon the state to get involved if a body is practicing fraud to gain a property. But two, the other thing is it is our right. It's our right. And I already addressed this in my live stream from last Friday, but Paul directly addresses this mentality in 1 Corinthians where he's quoting the people saying, all things are legal for me, all things are lawful for me. He says, but not all things are beneficial. And whenever a denominational body doesn't have the discernment to care about moral rectitude, but they're only concerned about what their right is, then that is a dead ringer that you have a morally bankrupt entity. If your case in doing something is, it's my right to do it, then that is not what a morally honorable person says or does. So on that basis alone, if you're going to call an assembly of people who claim to follow Jesus, but your case is not morally okay, we're not talking about legally okay. There's what's legal and there's what's moral. If you are not morally okay and you are casting your vote because you're taking your party line and you're just loyal to the bishop or the cabinet no matter what, then you're a stooge, man. I would say you shouldn't have any self-respect, first off. But secondly, you shouldn't be in the pulpit. If this is how you navigate issues and you just vote the party line, then I know you see yourself as the good guy, but that's just not that. Let's get into the document. Okay, all right, I'm gonna get over here to where I need to be. So this is the conference document. Frequently asked questions regarding the litigation brought by First UMC Oklahoma City against the conference. So this is what the annual conference says. On Monday, July 17th, Oklahoma County District Judge Altia Haynes Timmons issued a ruling regarding the litigation brought by First UMC Oklahoma City against the Conference Board of Trustees, Bishop Nunn, and former DS Reverend Victor McCullough. In that ruling, Judge Timmons said three things about the case. One, the Oklahoma Annual Conference may not complete a viability study of First United Methodist Church that the DS required and that is part of the disaffiliation agreement. As a result of this order, the members of the Oklahoma Conference will not receive the results of the study if the conclusion of the assessment was that the first UMC was determined to no longer be viable, which is a requirement of our disaffiliation agreement. Just briefly, they started the process, they punted for 3 months and didn't seem to be completing the process. That's why First Church filed suit to begin with. This viability study was a sham. It wasn't even written whenever they required it. This is the only church they've required to do that in this whole process, and it's nakedly because they desired the property. This is not something they made any other disaffiliating churches do. They couldn't substantiate any others in court. The second thing that the conference says that the judge made them do, an unofficial church meeting held at First UMC Oklahoma City on February 5th, 2023 should be counted as an official vote for disaffiliation. All other churches that have completed this process have held a duly authorized church conference called and conducted by their DS for this vote as required by our disaffiliation agreement. Once again, they only did that. They called for the vote was scheduled, the DS canceled it. So they had their own straw poll, which is now being honored. Third thing the conference says that the judge made them do, the Oklahoma Annual Conference should call a special annual conference by August 6th and invite delegates from the 55 churches already disaffiliated from the UMC in the April annual conference and provide them the full rights of the UMC members of the conference. I've talked to a couple people that couldn't make sense of this. It's because if they had to wait till October, that body is going to be much more hostile, especially whenever the conference has created this stink around them and their viability. The party lines have been drawn. In October, they don't have snowball's chance in hell getting out of this conference. The judge wanted to do her best to reconstruct the same opportunity for First Church that would have been available had the conference acted in good faith and they had come before the conference for ratification in April, as they should have. All right, so the conference says all three of these key items above are in direct conflict with either one, the documented disaffiliation agreement pursuant to paragraph 2553 that has been ratified by the Conference Board of Trustees, and two, the UMC Book of Discipline, or three, both. So I already know that what First Church argues is that paragraph 2553 and the conference's, if you didn't know this, the conference's trustees disaffiliation agreement has been updated multiple times, and it was just barely updated at the time. Actually, I shouldn't speak about it, but the first versions didn't have anything about a viability study, and even when they referred to a viability study, that study had not been authored yet. So they were referring to something that didn't exist, and they built the bridge as they walked it with Oklahoma City first, and then they refused to even complete it. So that's why the lawsuit was had. Okay, back to the conference document. The conference believes strongly in our process for disaffiliation, and it believes it should only recognize votes for disaffiliation that follow the procedures outlined in the disaffiliation agreement. Moreover, and most importantly, we certainly do not believe non-UMC persons should have a vote or otherwise participate in any annual conference meetings or other official matters. The ruling directs the conference to conduct its meetings in a manner that is contrary to the UMC's governing laws and constitution. So you hear this protectionist stance, this defensive stance, which part of me understands, but nobody, I don't think anybody, we're the shoe on the other foot. I think most liberals would completely change their place. But also, I think we can all hypothetically conceive of a situation where an institution starts abusing its power and there needs to be outside intervention. So if that is precluded from the outset, that is stacking the cards in favor of abuse. And so, yeah, this is what an abuser would say when someone steps in is, you have no right. If you imagine one spouse abusing another and a neighbor steps in, hey, she's my wife, you leave me and her alone. This is our business, not yours. Well, what if you're the bad guy? From the very beginning, there is no consideration that they could possibly be wrong. And if you can never consider the possibility that you are wrong, that's dangerous. You're going to do a lot of harm to people. All right, back to the document. Let's deal with the first question. The primary issue was the church viability study, which was ordered by the DS. What is that? So the answer they provide is a conversation on church viability from now on, and that's CCV, an acronym, CCV. Anytime you hear me say CCV, that's going to be the viability study. It's a study based on paragraphs 212 and 213 of the Book of Discipline. Our conference's disaffiliation agreement allows for this process. You can see that outlined on page 2 of the agreement. It is important to note that the disaffiliation agreement is not the only way it can be called. There are actually 2 ways. The first is paragraph 213. It can be called anytime the district superintendent chooses it, and 2, as requested at the discretion of the superintendent and before the church conference is held for a disaffiliation vote. In the case of First Church, there was disagreement as to the timing of the call for the study as well as the length of time to complete the study after it began. Nothing in the discipline or the disaffiliation agreement prescribes the amount of time the study should take, nor does anything prohibit the DS from canceling and rescheduling a church conference, which is a common practice should conditions warrant. So this is saying, once the language in paragraph 2553 and the disaffiliation agreement is that this timeline has to get going. Once the DS allows for the vote to be held, it has to happen within a certain amount of time. And so in the court proceedings, they actually got our conference chancellor up there, who I actually think is a really intelligent guy, and I like Kent Fulton a lot. But he made the case, well, yeah, unless the DS cancels it, in which case you've got a situation like in Seinfeld whenever Jerry and Kramer made a bet, and then when the conditions changed, Kramer just said, well, bet's off. And Jerry says, that's not how a bet works. You have to go through with it once you've made the bet. And Kramer refuses to understand it. And that's pretty much what the conference's case was here is, yeah, we know the DS set the date and made the commitment, but then he canceled it. Viability study that hadn't been written yet. And it was just put in the disaffiliation agreement. And so according to the case they made, they could indefinitely reschedule, hypothetically, past the end of the year when paragraph 2553 wouldn't even apply anymore. So the judge in her ruling said that that is on its face ridiculous, and I would agree. All right. The study was requested and has been fulfilled without complication by multiple churches in the Oklahoma Annual Conference as a routine part of the process that is documented in the disaffiliation agreement. In the event of a conclusion in the study that a church is not viable and the church still wishes to proceed with the disaffiliation process, the goal of the Oklahoma Annual Conference is to present the appropriate data to the entire conference so that the lay and clergy members have full information as they vote on ratification of that church's disaffiliation in October 2023. So they right there have said something that I've contradicted, which is they say, oh, a lot of churches have gone through this. I'm confident after their time with conference officials on the stand, not a single other disaffiliating church was subjected to this. Now, supposedly, they have a viability process for churches that have previously elected to go through it, which the facilitator this time, Craig Stinson, said that he had led a number of churches through. But that seems to have been a different thing altogether, because whatever this viability study was that they subjected Oklahoma City First to was not even authored whenever they required it. So I don't know how those pieces fit together, and even Judge Timmons wasn't sure how they do. But the conference has repeatedly claimed that other churches have gone through this mandated before a vote, but I haven't heard a single church substantiated for this. So I'm not going to say the conference officials are lying, but I'm going to say that they've made a big claim here that they have not backed up, and that's a problem. That should bother everybody, because if that isn't true, then this is nakedly a grab for the property, because they're saying, well, they can still say that they want to disaffiliate after this, but we're going to come and read our report to the whole annual conference while they're assembled so they can make an informed decision, even though they haven't done that for a single other church. So that's pretty nakedly so as to like sour the assembly to vote against them. So they can say, well, we didn't keep them from coming before the body, but the body made up its mind. It's dishonest. The viability study at First UMC Oklahoma City could have been completed in advance of all deadlines necessary for the church to have requested disaffiliation for the October special conference, so of this upcoming one. On June 1st, 2023, a temporary restraining order was issued prohibiting the conference from completing the process, and then on July 17, 2023, District Judge Aletia Haynes Timmons issued an injunction prohibiting the conference from completing the process at all. Therefore, members of the conference will be asked to approve this potential disaffiliation request without information which should have been available to them were the process completed and a finding had been made that First GMC was not viable. So that website that I showed you a minute ago, I'm going to close this document here. That website I showed you a minute ago that had the conference made available. No, not the conference, First Church. You remember that website? It had their own FAQs at the top, and then it had this document we're going to look at, but it also had all the court documents. First off, one of the things I forgot to say is you don't do that if you're on the side of wrong. You do that when you know you're on the side of right. Secondly, I looked through a lot of those documents already. On them are email correspondences with the facilitators of this viability study. What they just said in their FAQ was they could have completed it by October and gone through the whole process in earnest. If you read the email correspondences, you will see they had no intention of scheduling the final meeting. That they called for it time and time again from First Church, and the answer from the facilitator was, "Hey, we're really busy. I'm just not able to put it together right now." Punted for 3 months, and then they finally filed suit. So, yes, hypothetically, anything's possible. There seemed to be no signs that the conference was going to be acting in good faith, and that's why First Church responded. All right, let's look at the First Church responses to the conference's FAQs. So this is now authored by First Church. This is the other side of this. So the primary issue was that the church's viability study, which was ordered by the district superintendent. What is that? So here's their answer. Paragraph 212 and 213 of the discipline in a normal setting can be a useful tool to a local church. I'm going to let you see the document here. However, implemented in the disaffiliation process, it can become weaponized by the conference leadership for churches wanting to disaffiliate. The conference will have you believe it is strictly a useful tool for the churches to make decisions on its future. But the options available to the local church in paragraph 213 are far different than the options to the local church in the disaffiliation agreement. Paragraph 213 of the discipline allows for a local church to have a serious conversation on whether or not to continue as a church body, close its doors, or request assistance from the conference. Man, I hate when they don't use an Oxford comma. That drives me nuts. Whatever. But those choices are the decision of the local church. The conference would say that they get that decision. They just don't have the decision as to whether or not to go through the viability study. All right, back to First Church's document. The conference claims that the conversation on church viability, CCV process, is in accordance with paragraphs 212 and 213 of the discipline. This is untrue. The testimony at the trial revealed the conference did not develop the CCV process until after the DS canceled First Church's conference scheduled on January 22nd. Conference leaders were forced to admit at trial that the CCV process they developed is not in accordance with paragraph 213 or any other provision of the discipline. They admitted that the CCV process is not the same as the, quote, conversation on church potential process they previously used before the disaffiliation process was enacted. So that's how I think that they say that they've done this several times before. There was a CCP process which has similar goals, but is a completely different document. And so it was dishonest of them to say, hey, we've done this with lots of churches before. They hadn't done it with a single other church before. It was a new document, new process. The conference leaders developed a different process specifically because of their desire to prohibit First Church from participating in the disaffiliation process. That's a good, strong statement for you right there. Back to the First Church document. The conference's FAQs state the CCV, quote, has been fulfilled without complication by multiple churches in the Oklahoma Annual Conference as a routine part of the conference that is documented in the disaffiliation agreement. Okay, that was in the FAQ that we just heard from. At trial, this is back to First Church's words, at trial, the conference had an opportunity to disclose the name of the multiple churches who had to undergo a viability study as part of paragraph 2553. They failed to name any church and continue to fail to do so. The conference's FAQs are directly contradictory to the judge's findings after 3 days of trial. They're not calling them liars. They don't fit with people sworn under oath and what they said. The conference's FAQs also suggest First Church refused to complete the CCV process. It is true that on June 1st, 2023, the court issued a temporary restraining order halting the CCV process. However, the court found it was the conference who failed to follow its own disaffiliation process. First Church did everything possible to comply, notwithstanding the fact the CCV process was improper and in violation of First Church's rights, but was denied the ability to participate in the process by the conference's delay tactics. So they're saying we didn't stop. We participated in good faith even though we didn't have to. And it was you guys, it was the conference that refused to see its own process through. Next paragraph in the First Church document. In a disaffiliation situation, paragraph 213 becomes a tool for conference leadership to either close your doors or not ratify your request to disaffiliate. In fact, the disaffiliation agreement utilized by the Oklahoma Annual Conference states a report of non-viability will be provided to the annual conference for the ratification vote. Why? Because it's about the property. The conference intends to try to persuade the annual conference delegates to deem a local church non-viable so the conference can justify taking control of the property. First Church has been abundantly clear it has no plans to sell its property or cease its ministry to downtown Oklahoma City. In fact, just the opposite. The congregation fully intends to remain in its present location and carry out its ministry as God has directed since the land run. After the Oklahoma City federal bombing in 1995, First Church was severely damaged, but literally hung a banner on its damaged building proclaiming, "Our God reigns and we will remain." This is where God put us, and this is where we will remain, carrying out his will. This slogan continues to be our promise even today, through the disaffiliation process and the attempted property grab by the conference leadership. So what I'm taking away from this, as we're looking through this, is what the conference is giving is not the whole truth, and in fact is lacking some important details and seems to intentionally mischaracterize what has transpired so far. Now, you would expect an immature person, a non-believer, to behave in such a way, a self-justifying way, to imagine that there are mature Christian believers who are mischaracterizing a situation where they have something to gain is a big problem. Let's look at the next part in the FAQ from the conference. Much has been said about membership records. What is that about? The conference says, an important part of the process in calling for the disaffiliation church conference is submission and approval of a membership roster. First UMC submitted their membership roster on January 12th, with 487 members listed, some 2,100 members having been removed by, quote, correction of their end-of-year membership report submitted at the end of December 2022. This extraordinary membership removal was done without the appropriate charge conference action, as outlined in the Book of Discipline of the UMC, a process that takes 2 years, 2 annual charge conference votes, and not 2 weeks. Names had not been submitted nor documentation provided of efforts to contact inactive members for 2 years before being removed. Instead, the explanation was that they simply could not find or verify their membership. Within the context of the local church conference disaffiliation vote, this raises concerns of potential voter suppression and irregularity in the conduct of the vote, in that 2,100 persons who were professing members of First UMC on December 31st were no longer members or entitled to vote on disaffiliation at a called church conference in 2023. Conference leaders brought their concern about the status of First UMC's membership rolls to their attention numerous times from July 2022 through March 2023 for all churches considering disaffiliation, and frankly for churches that aren't. Keeping membership records up to date is vital. The conference has a page on our website dedicated to this process. I couldn't agree more with the last paragraph, the last 2 sentences. It's very important to have relevant, good, updated membership records. But I got some real problems with this. But let's look at what the First Church critique is. So here's the First Church critique. Much has been said, and here's the question, about membership records. What is that about? Here's First Church's answer. The conference's FAQ suggests First Church was denied the ability to participate in the disaffiliation process because their membership rolls were incorrect. The court specifically held the conference leaders did not give written notice to First Church that they could not vote on disaffiliation because of their insufficient membership rolls. So The conference just said they were told multiple times between last year and this year that it was a problem. What First Church established was there is not any paper trail to substantiate that. That's just hearsay. That's just he said, she said. There is no evidence for that. The court, the district superintendent's only reason given in writing for the cancellation of First Church's conference is that First Church must participate in a viability study. There was no mention of membership roles until the lawsuit was filed. The court found that First Church's membership roles were in compliance with what was required of them. So see link to this letter from the DS. So you have that on the FAQ page. Any change in numbers on the membership roll were submitted by the senior pastor of First Church, who is staying in the United Methodist Church and not leaving the conference, even though First Church seeks disaffiliation. In accordance with the discipline, clergy are responsible for the membership rolls. These rolls or numbers were not brought before the administrative council for review or approval. The court concluded the conference could not deny First Church its request to disaffiliate based on its own representatives' actions or inactions. So hypothetically, a conference could just have one of their own agents in charge who bungles it, and then they're going, well, shucks, we can't have the vote because the records are no good. So this substantiates that the reason the membership rolls were bloated is not because of the church acting in bad faith. It's because their pastors had other priorities and didn't focus on reconciling the membership. And it stinks. I mean, it's bad. It's not good. But to say that they can't go forward with a ratification vote because of it is an issue. That's not what they said. What they did was they said, you need a viability study. And when they pushed back and it wasn't going well, it was only later that they said anything in writing about the membership rolls. So they even got conference staff on the stand saying that they hadn't made an issue of it until after all this had escalated. So it may or may not be dishonest, but it's definitely disingenuous. All right, so let's go to the next one on the conference FAQ. Here we go. Does this ruling impact any other churches or the disaffiliation process? No, this ruling only impacts First Church Oklahoma City's request for disaffiliation. Statements made by Judge Timmons about our disaffiliation process in no way implicate the conference. Her opinion is that we did not follow a process, but in doing so, she violated many of the provisions of the discipline in her ruling. We also view her intervention in our church polity and practice as a violation of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Churches seeking disaffiliation should continue to follow the process established in the annual conference or risk not being eligible due to failing to meet the requirements of the disaffiliation agreement for a disaffiliation ratification vote at the meeting of the annual conference in October. So the question was, does this ruling impact any other churches or the disaffiliation process? And they say no, because this ruling only impacts them. Well, that seems to miss the question. Like, yeah, it impacts other churches. They could hypothetically insist on other churches going through the same process that then they fail to go through. They say that they act as though it all fit together and they were fitting it together well, but they designed a process with a timeline that then they broke and didn't honor. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go to the Hardy Patton interview. But that honestly just makes no sense to me. Let's look at how First Church answered that. While it is not anticipated this ruling will affect any other church in the disaffiliation process, it could protect any church that may be unfairly required to fulfill conditions precedent to a vote on disaffiliation that they are not specifically set forth in paragraph 2553 of the discipline. So I think what I understand them to be saying is, based on Timmons' ruling, they could be protecting other churches from having to go through this fraudulent process, which kind of benevolent. Okay, so let's go back to the conference document. Will the UMC have a presence in downtown Oklahoma City? The answer they submitted was the downtown area is one of the fastest growing and diverse areas of our state. We intend to maintain a presence in that area and will work first with churches in the area, including Wesley UMC and Crown Heights UMC, as we consider our next steps should the disaffiliation be ratified. We will also be in discussion with the Christ Experience about their future location as they have been housed in First Church for a number of years. So, yeah, they're saying, hey, hypothetically, we could lose, and we will try and continue to minister in downtown Oklahoma City. Okay, so this is the first answer. Okay, this is a lengthier answer from First Church. The Christ Experience was a church plant. I don't remember if it was a church, another United Methodist church that met in First Church, and they're asking about that. How will that continue? And so the answer is the Christ Experience currently meets within the facility owned by First Church. When TCE, the Christ Experience, needed a place to meet and worship several years ago, First Church graciously opened its facility in its arms and welcomed them into the facility. While they pay a nominal rent to help with utilities, First Church and the Christ Experience enjoy a friendly and gracious relationship, often sharing events together. There are no plans to request the Christ Experience to move out of the facility, even if First Church disaffiliates. Therefore, the UMC will continue to have a presence in downtown Oklahoma City if we are approved for disaffiliation. However, it is important to note that a requirement that a presence remain in a community in order to ratify a local church's disaffiliation request has not been applied to any of the 84 churches who have disaffiliated to date. Again, First Church requests fair treatment by the delegates to annual conference. So what they're saying is questions are being asked at this annual conference to scrutinize a church that have not been asked for any other churches. They're putting they're moving the goalposts, or they're establishing new standards that no other churches have had to meet, which is by definition inequitable. The next question that the conference put on their FAQ is the litigation with First Church simply a property dispute? They answer, this is not a property dispute, as First Church's representatives continue to argue. This is about paragraph 2553 in the discipline, the basis of which is to address, quote, the current deep conflict within the UMC around the issues of human sexuality. The deep conflict is addressed by creating a process by which a local church has a limited right to cease to be a part of the UMC. One of the outcomes of completing that disaffiliation process is the release of the trust clause of the UMC. There is no dispute about property. If a local church completes the disaffiliation process and its disaffiliation is ratified by the annual conference, then the trust clause is released and all local church property belongs to that local church alone. This litigation with First UMC implicates the First Amendment of the UMC, the constitutions of the country, and this ruling takes away the rights of the 365 local churches and the thousands of members of this annual conference to live out their faith as they see fit through the self-governance of their denomination by faithful believers. You hear that bit? They're taking away your rights, all right? We have a right to rob these people of their property if we want to. We have a right to hold them up, kick the can, create this fraudulent process if we want to, and how dare the government step in and make us behave like Christians. Of course, if you're listening to this on a podcast, I hope that was clear. That wasn't in the conference text. But I think that would be a fair interpretation of what they're saying here. It completely sidesteps the moral issue and just comes into, we have the right to do this. What does First Church say in addressing this? The question was, is the litigation simply a property dispute? And they give the opposite answer. Absolutely, this is about property. So the conference said, no, this is a theological dispute that has implications for property. First Church is saying, no, this is a property dispute. Back into the document. While paragraph 2553 of the discipline allows for any congregation to have a gracious exit, First Church's attempt at exiting has been anything but gracious when considering the, quote, need for a viability study of a church that is trying to leave the conference. One would have to reasonably ask the question, why? Why does the conference care if a church that leaves is viable or not? One reason, the property. The conference is fully aware First Church is debt-free and has property valued in excess of $30 million. First Church's real property sits directly across the street from the Oklahoma City bombing memorial, and the congregation has been actively involved for years with the bombing memorial. Everything from hosting U.S. presidents, senators, governors, and numerous local and national dignitaries as part of the memorial events. The church itself was severely damaged during the bombing in '95. The congregation was relocated to another facility for worship for the next 3+ years. As the testimony revealed in court, the conference's leadership did not provide financial or facility support while First Church was displaced. Rather, it was Trinity Baptist Church that stepped up and offered their facility to the First Church congregation to utilize for all worship needs. And a businessman, not the conference, offered office space for the First Church's staff. That's embarrassing. What's the point of connection if they're not even getting you through? First Church has always been sustainable without any assistance from the conference. The congregation is a giving congregation, and all staff salaries, missions, utilities, insurance are fully paid for by the congregation. The facility has no mortgage, as it was paid off years ago by the faithful and committed contributions of its congregation. As far as apportionments go, First Church has paid a higher percentage of its apportionments than many of the churches who disaffiliated in April with no viability study. There's been nothing to warrant a viability study for First Church as evidenced by our track record, so that leaves only one reason: the property. The conference's FAQs fail to mention that the court agreed with First Church's interpretation of paragraph 2553. Annual conferences may develop additional standard terms for the disaffiliation agreement between the local church and the conference board of trustees after the local church has conducted its church conference to vote on disaffiliation. We're talking about disaffiliation agreement language now. This is explicit language in the disagreement that they did not abide by. Back into the document. Paragraph 2553 does not allow annual conferences to develop an additional standard terms for the decision-making process set forth in paragraph 2553, the church conference process. When the conference set as a condition that a district superintendent may require a viability study prior to a church vote, the conference breached 2553. Regardless, the conference did not follow its own process for conducting a viability study. The court found the conference was simply using the viability study as an excuse to prevent First Church from exercising its right to disaffiliate. All right, so there's only one more question here in the FAQ. Will this ruling be appealed? And the answer from the conference was yes. The ruling blatantly interferes with what is and should be an internal process, church process, protected under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. The district court has no right or jurisdiction to intervene in the internal affairs of a religious entity. And this unwarranted and erroneous decision represents a threat to all institutions of faith who now must fear intervention of the secular courts into their internal self-governance. The conference is committed to adhering to church law, following the disaffiliation process, and representing the conference. We have consistently honored the documented and approved disaffiliation process for every church that has expressed interest in disaffiliating. First Church is no exception. Dude, that just feels dishonest at this point. When you're looking at a church that you've treated so differently from every other church and you're saying, we're acting equitably, I don't see how they square that. Final bit from the conference. The courts have no role to play in the management of church affairs, including local church disaffiliation from the UMC. This is an internal matter of church polity and self-governance. So they make that argument that I already covered earlier. The ecclesiastical extension doctrine, the Free Exercise Clause, that only applies. That applies all the time, except in the case of fraud, which was substantiated here. So what does First Church answer? The First Church congregation believes strongly in the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. However, this is not about infringing on anyone's religious rights. This goes back to the property dispute. When a local church is being harmed by the very entity that determines the outcome of the harm, then the conference, in essence, is becoming the judge and jury. The local church must have a legal advocate to hear the evidence and render an impartial ruling that protects those that are harmed. While the conference states that they're committed to adhering to church law, it is those same conference leaders who violated church law when they instituted a viability study that was not permitted by 2553's gracious exit. The conference's disaffiliation agreement is inconsistent with the standard agreement, which doesn't allow for viability studies for disaffiliating churches. Again, why do they need a viability study on a church that intends to leave? It is a property issue. So there are a lot of other issues at play here. I could do a 24-hour video that would not cover all the issues here. The things that I hope become clear as you go through this are that there is a clear moral stand here. And I've said it several times before on this show. I'll say it again. If you find yourself in a place of coercive power over others, where you are seriously considering overruling the clear will of an individual or a group, then you are not on Jesus' side. Maybe if you're a Reformed Christian and you believe that God compels people to be saved or damned against their will, or that they have no will, fine, you can behave in that way. But when you're an Arminian Wesleyan institution and you believe that Jesus doesn't force us to be saved, but that he lets us choose him after he's already chosen us, and that he lets us refuse him after he has refused us, and he lets us go away and backslide and apostatize. If he lets us do that, then why on earth would an ecclesiastical authority rob individual churches of that right? Why would they deprive them of that and say, well, actually, according to our ecclesiastical layout, we can take your building. We can declare exigent circumstances. We can vote not to let you go. You're just not on the side of Jesus when you do that. It's just a very black and white, very clear moral picture. And it doesn't matter what other facts you throw into that. You can't muddy that. That's a clear black and white thing. There are clear moral imperatives in life. Otherwise, so many people are living in a world where I've got my side, they've got their side, I've got my facts, they've got their facts, and it's just complicated, so it's just power politics. I'm going to vote my side, they're going to vote their side, whoever has as many votes wins, except if I don't get my way, in which case I'm going to stay and get my way anyway, as they did after General Conference 2019. There's the facts here. I don't doubt that there's good-intentioned people on the other side, but they're wrong in this case. First Church deserves the same right as every other church. And because the world got involved, they're going to get something like that. The reality is that a lot of people's hearts are now being turned against them because the conference representing this case represents it as bad world powers trying to take religious liberty, which it doesn't seem to be the case. And then this bad church just refused to play ball. They just didn't have the humility to go through this process that everybody else was subjected to. It's dishonest. And for the people who just don't even care to look into it, I'm really sad about that. But to the conference who put this together and is continuing to prosecute this when they should know that they're wrong, that's really sad too. And I don't know what to say about that. I don't like talking ill of anybody, and I would like to imagine that there are other factors at play that I'm not fully appreciating, but there doesn't seem to be anything getting beyond the basic moral equation here. And so I'm just really hoping that those who are prosecuting imperial coercive power and escalating to the point of wasting a lot of tax dollars and apportionment dollars on an unnecessary battle, I just pray that they would repent, that they would back down, that they would behave equitably, even if that costs them $30 million properties. Surely that has to be something that people are willing to do when they follow Jesus. So I don't know. I don't know how to wrap this up. I'm going to do maybe a couple other small segments on it. There are some Facebook posts that have been made that are interesting. I got into it with Jeremy Smith a little bit on Twitter. So anyway, if y'all have any questions about any of this, and you think, if you trust me, then just ask me, and I'll do my best to answer them in writing online. But if you don't trust me, ask First Church. Go to the FAQ. Man, if there's one thing I could tell you to do, it's to go to that FAQ page from First Church. Really an incredible resource. Look at the primary documents. They speak for themselves. I hope this has been useful to you. Appreciate all the time and attention. I hope it's worthy. I'll see you later.